We'll say, I was told that Dean McGreal already stole my line about how nervous he was coming right after the judge, but can you imagine how I must feel going after a judge, a federal judge, and also the dean of the law school? So there are particular reasons that I'm nervous about this presentation. The second reason that I'm nervous about this particular presentation is because substance abuse is something that's a little bit outside of my bailiwick. For all of you that have attended a CLE before in which I presented, everybody knows that I'm a patent attorney. I'm a one-trick pony, I do patent law, and that's about it. So what on earth is a patent law guy doing talking about substance abuse? Well, the answer to that is very simple. I'd gotten together with a colleague of mine, Ria Shalnat, who is the former president of Cincy IP, and we were talking about giving presentations. It was just on the tail end of one of her presentations where she had talked about patent trolls and these folks that are going out and suing everybody after they acquire a piece of intellectual property, and she specifically focused on software patent trolls. And she had done such a fantastic job that I said, hey, you did a fantastic job on that. And she goes, well, I was really nervous because it was something that was outside of my area of expertise. So we got onto this little, we patent folks are kind of nerdy, we're geeks and eggheads, and so we got into this little topic of trash talking about what presentations can we give that are outside of our area of comfort. And we converged on substance abuse, and one of the things that was baffling during our talk, and I'll share this with you as well, is the statistics from the State Bar of Ohio, the State Bar of Georgia, State of Washington, as a matter of fact, all of the 50 states in the United States have statistics that are quite alarming. And those statistics are this. The incidence of substance abuse in the legal profession is about 3 times greater than the incidence of substance abuse in the general population. And we thought to ourselves as we were discussing this, that just doesn't make sense. From a common sense perspective, it doesn't make sense, and here's why. Because the legal profession consists of individuals, all of you folks here, that are some of the most educated demographics of any group of people in the United States. And for all of the people that should know better than to tamper with substances or to get addicted to something, we are that group that should know better. If that's the case, then common sense would dictate that the incidence of substance abuse for attorneys should be much lower than that of the general population. But if we look at the numbers don't play out that way. And so we started going back and forth and asking the question, why is that? And ultimately, that led to a side project of mine that led to this particular presentation. I did a little bit of research to find out what it was that made us, as a group, so vulnerable to this thing called addiction. And so today's presentation, I'll give you a disclaimer right now. Today's presentation is more so of a scientific presentation, because I'm a nerd, as I said, I'm a scientist at heart, than it is a legal presentation. And hopefully you'll get something out of this presentation from the aspect of science. And specifically, we're going to talk about the human decision-making process. If we are as smart as we claim that we are, then why on earth is it that we make these monumentally stupid decisions every once in a while? And if we understand what our decision-making process is, then I think we have a glimpse into that. Now, in order for us to properly get substance abuse CLE, the State Bar of Ohio actually requires a couple of things that I do need to say here, and we'll get that out of the way as quickly as we can so that I can get into the fun part of the topic that I'm interested in. So, Dr. Helen Farrell, who is a forensic psychiatrist at Harvard Medical School, she and I actually gave a presentation together, but she has boiled it down to these 4 questions, and she says that if you can answer yes, or if you answer yes to any 2 of these following 4 questions, then it might be worth your while to sit back and evaluate whether or not you have an addiction. And so we'll start off with those 4 questions. We'll put those aside, go through the entire rest of the presentation, and then revisit those 4 questions at the end. So here are the 4 questions that I want you to keep in the back of your mind as we go through the presentation. And remember, if you answer yes to any 2 of these 4, then it's worth your while to sit down and kind of do an evaluation, am I addicted to this substance? The first question is this, have you ever asked yourself a question, I really should cut back on this? Question number 1, have you ever asked yourself the question, I should really cut back on this? Question number 2, have you ever needed this substance as an eye-opener? Have you ever needed this substance as an eye-opener? And what that means is you wake up in the morning and you tell yourself, I really can't go through this day unless I have this. Okay? Question number 3, have you ever gotten annoyed or frustrated when you've been cut off from the substance? Have you ever gotten annoyed or frustrated if you've ever gotten cut off from this substance? And the final question, question number 4, is have you ever missed a deadline or something important, or been late for something? Essentially, have you ever been late for something or missed a deadline because of this substance? And if you've answered yes to any 2 of these 4, then there is a possibility that you are addicted to that particular substance that you said yes to. Why do I have a picture of me up on the board over there? I'll start off with something that's completely unrelated to the talk altogether. I have long hair because I just haven't had time to go and get a haircut. And the other day when I was at Dewey's, I was sitting down with one of my female colleagues here. And as the wait staff is coming over to her, she looks over and before she even approaches the table, she does her routine. How are we ladies doing today? And I looked up and I thought to myself, today is the day I need to get a haircut. But I never got around to that. Huh? And she started apologizing profusely and said, I'm so sorry, to which I responded, that's okay, I've been called worse. The reason I put this slide on the screen is because I actually wanted to pay tribute to my PhD advisor who had actually given me some of the best advice that I'd ever gotten, and you'll see why this is relevant later. He'd always told me when we were doing the research that if you ask the wrong question, you'll always get the wrong answer. If you ask the wrong question, you'll always get the wrong answer. So he said, if you're applying for grants and you want to get money from NIH or any of these grant funding agencies, the key here is to ask the right question, because if you don't ask the right question, nobody's ever going to want to know what the answer is. Nobody's going to care about the answer. So make sure that you craft the answer or the question in such a way that you're going to get the right answer. The reason that I bring this thing up is because the State Bar of Ohio, as I said, and Georgia, Washington, all of these other states, they take substance abuse very, very seriously. And so they have all of these programs that deal with substance abuse, but they all treat them with one very simple presumption. And that presumption is this. They presume that the legal profession is very, very stressful, and it is the stress of the profession that causes all of these people to become addicts. And based on that presumption, all of these treatment plans, all of the programs that they have are put in place based on that one particular presumption. And today I wanted to kind of question that presumption, and the reason for that is because other professions have a lot of stress as well, but we don't see the same incidence of substance abuse there. In 1998, when I started law school, there was a fellow by the name of Doug Yarn that did a study at Georgia State University, and he called the study Spit for Science. And he was a law professor that taught professional responsibility, and one of the tests that he wanted to do was he wanted to find out if those students that were attracted to the legal profession, the people that come to law school, had a higher level of testosterone than the general population. So he gave all of the incoming 1Ls in 1998 a vial that had a random number on it. It was a double-blind study, and he asked everybody, can you just spit into this, put it in the envelope, don't mark it with any identifying marks, and submit it for us? And what we'll do is we'll correlate the numbers later. We're doing this double-blind study to see if those that are in the legal profession have a higher incidence of testosterone. That result finally came out, and the result was this, that lawyers do indeed have a higher level of testosterone, and those people that go to law school actually go to law school with a higher level of testosterone than the general population. What's also a little bizarre about the study was, after they did the correlation, they carved it out according to the demographics, and they found out that some of the women that are attorneys also have a higher level of testosterone than some of the men that are in the general population. So there's definitely a biophysiological correlation between those people that become attorneys or that want to practice law and the people that are attracted to the profession, which got me to thinking, and this is the question that got me thinking, is we always deal with the substance abuse problem as if it's the environment that creates the addicts. But what if the converse is true? What if it's those that are predisposed to addiction are the ones that are attracted to the profession? Let me say that again. What if those that are predisposed to addiction are the ones that are attracted to the profession? If that's really the case, then what we're doing as the State Bar of Ohio or any of the other states that deal with substance abuse, we are actually trying to treat a problem based on the wrong premise. And all of the programs that we have in place, all of the things that we do, are going to be addressing it in a manner that only does a Band-Aid fix without going to the root of the problem. Now, with that as the background for the research that I did to put together this presentation, we go to this fellow right here. When I showed this picture to my students, they asked, are you putting up a picture of Jesus because you're at a Marianist Catholic institution? and I told them, I said, well, granted that we are in a Marianist Catholic institution, that's not Jesus. That happens to be Plato. And the reason that I put him up on the screen is because I wanted to illustrate a particular point with reference to Plato. And it's not just something that's unique to Plato, it's actually something that's ubiquitous to our entire society from the birth of our society. Humankind has always been separated from the animals based on one thing and one thing only. It's our capacity to reason. We've been told since our birth, we've been told since the dawn of time that what separates us from our four-legged creature beasts, pets that we have, is our capacity to be reasoned. The rational human mind is what makes us human beings and not some of the beasts of the field. And that's why, we were created on the sixth day according to the account in Genesis. That's why if we even look at the Greek mythology, Prometheus, when he carved man out of clay, first thing that he did was he brought man to Athena, who was the goddess of wisdom, and asked, will you please impute or infuse wisdom into this creature that I've created? And thus man became a rational creature. And this whole rationality theory is so strong that we can trace it back to a couple of millennia, going all the way back to the days of Plato. And Plato actually writes in an allegory of the chariot that this is how the human mind works. And he likens the human mind to this chariot that is harnessed up to two horses. There's a white horse and there's a black horse. The white horse represents our good, positive emotions like joy, happiness, righteous indignation, justice. All of these things are represented by the white horse. The black horse represents emotions also, but the black horse represents negative emotions like fear, anxiety, hatred. All of these fears are represented by the black horse. And he says that the human brain is like the chariot that's harnessed up to these two emotional, impetuous horses, where the horses are trying to lead this mind, the decision-making process, in all sorts of different directions, and they make us make bad decisions. When we make emotional decisions, they always turn out to be bad, like putting too much money on your credit card or taking out subprime mortgages that you can't pay off. All of these things are the result of emotions, whether they be positive or negative. But thankfully, according to the allegory of the chariot has a rider on it. And this rider's name is reason. It is the rational human mind. And reason has a rein on these impetuous beasts that are trying to take this chariot off course. And Plato theorized that whoever could keep the tightest reins on these emotions and bring these two horses together could guide the chariot on path and make the best decisions ever, because they would not be clouded by all of these emotions that were trying to lead the chariot astray. And so he theorized that whoever was the most in control of this chariot would be the best decision maker in the world. Whoever could just devoid themselves of emotion would become the best decision maker. And this theory was so important, this theory was so influential, that it became the founding theory for all of our academic institutions. If we look at the universities, all of the universities are based on reason, rationale, and then the study of reason. All of modern economics is based on this theory that we are rational human beings, and all of the economic theories presuppose that if we get a bunch of reasonable people together, then the group of reasonable minds will behave in such a way that we can predict what the economy will do. And there's a fellow that appears often on NPR. His name is Jonah Lehrer, who's written a book called How We Decide. And a lot of this material is actually from that book, so I'll give him proper credit for it and then just plagiarize off of him. I'm an academic. I think I'm allowed to do that under fair use. But anyways, he talks about this theory of the human. He creates a fictional creature called the Homo economicus, the person that you find in the economic textbooks. That's the rational human being upon which all of the economic theories are based. Now, what's really bizarre about that, and what's really coincidental about that also, is there is another fictional creature that I would like to call, and this is my own phrase, the Homo juridicus, the reasonable judicial being. And it is that Homo juridicus actually permeates through our entire legal existence. If you think about it, if we think about proximate causation, we're talking about reasonable relation to the harm, et cetera, et cetera. There's the reasonable human being standard. So the theory of rationality is a very, very powerful theory upon which a lot of the things in our society are based. There's one problem with that theory, that we as human beings are uber-rational human beings. And the problem with that theory is that that theory is wrong. We are not uber-rational human beings. There are a lot of things that happen in our subconscious mind when we make decisions. The conscious part of it is the stuff that deals with the rationality. But there is a subterranean layer of emotions that actually guides and governs our decision-making process. And if you're thinking to yourself, that can't be right, I'd hate to believe that. The first conclusive piece of evidence to show this comes from this gentleman right here. This guy is Dr. Antonio Damasio. He is actually a clinical psychiatrist and also a professor at the University of Southern California, USC, and he teaches psychiatry there. And he is one of the people that studies human behavior. And he writes about one of his case studies. He talks about a fellow by the name of Elliot. And I'm not sure why psychiatrists do that. They create one name, fictitious names to do case studies because they want to protect the identity of their subject, but then they describe their subject in great detail that if you really wanted to, you could find out who they were. But anyway, he talks about this fellow by the name of Elliot. Now, who is Elliot? Well, I'm glad you asked. Elliot was an accounting executive at a Fortune 500 company. He was a really smart guy. He scored in the top 97th percentile in all of his intelligence tests. He led a group of people in his company to make the company very, very successful. And he was considered by many people to be a very, very good decision maker. And the reason for that is because he would not have been in the position that he was in had he not been a good decision maker. Well, Elliot had a problem. In the early 1980s, he was diagnosed with a brain tumor in his orbitofrontal cortex. And the doctors told him, we really need to get this tumor out. You need to go in for the surgery. So they put him under the knife, and when Elliot eventually emerged from the surgery, everybody considered the surgery to be a success. The operation was successful because Elliot could still move his arms and legs. He had all control of his motor skills. He didn't lose his speech. His eyes weren't blurred. Essentially, he emerged physically exactly the same being after the surgery as he was before the surgery, with the exception of the tumor that was in his orbitofrontal cortex. So everybody applauded the surgeons and said, that's a great thing that you've done. This guy has emerged well. The surgery is a success. Well, a couple of weeks later, people started to realize that Elliot was not the same person after the surgery as he was before the surgery. The removal of the portion of the orbitofrontal cortex actually did have a very, very profound side effect on Elliot, and it was not a physical side effect. What that removal of the orbitofrontal cortex, or portions of it, did was it made Elliot lose the ability to feel all sorts of emotions. So all of these regular emotions that you and I feel on a daily basis, happiness, fear, anxiety, joy, all of these positive and negative emotions, Elliot completely lost the ability to sense these emotions. Now, one would think that if we go back to Plato's theory, Elliot would then emerge as the best decision maker in the world, right? Because then he would not be bounded by all these impetuous horses that are trying to lead him astray. He would just make the rational decisions and become the best decision maker ever. He would become the philosopher king. But what Dr. Damasio found was that the contrary happened. Rather than being the best decision maker ever, Elliot became pathologically indecisive. And Dr. Damasio writes in his journal about Elliot some of the things that he observed. He would give Elliot a patient consent form for Elliot to sign, and he would watch as Elliot would sit there and struggle and wrestle for a half hour to 45 minutes, asking, should I sign this thing with a black pen or a blue pen? And eventually he would converge on a color and sign the document. Later on in the day, if he was to go out to lunch somewhere, he would sit there and wrestle for 2 to 3 hours on which restaurant he should go out to for lunch. And if he finally converged on where he should go for lunch, once he got to the restaurant, if they were still serving off the lunch menu, it would still take him another 3 to 4 hours trying to decide what sandwich to order. And so when it was all said and done, Dr. Damasio concluded that there was this subterranean, subconscious layer that was involved in our decision-making process that was completely devoid of the rational part of our mind. And he said that maybe we don't appreciate its significance, but there is an emotional aspect of it that drives all of our decision-making processes. We will talk about addiction later, and cell phone addiction is one of them that I'd like to talk about, so I'll just call out and embarrass people here. Sorry, no, that's all right, that's all right. It's your CLE, so have at it. All right, so all of you are probably thinking, that makes sense. Damasio's study kind of makes sense, but come on. Which color pen to use, what sandwich to order, these are not monumental decisions. These are kind of trite decisions that we make on a daily basis. And for all of these trite decisions, I can understand that emotion takes a role in there. But certainly for the monumental decisions in our lives, the things that are important, the things that deal with our future, life and death decisions, the rising and falling of nations, those decisions have to be based on reason, right? That brings us to this fella right here. And the story of this fella, probably wondering who this guy is. This guy is Lieutenant Commander Michael Riley. And his story comes to us on the second day of the ground invasion for the First Persian Gulf War. And if you remember the First Persian Gulf War, it was in January of that year when the ground invasion took place. But the 6 weeks prior to that, the Allied forces, including the British Navy and the US Navy, had gotten together and sent their battleships, their destroyers, their entire armada of 22 battleships, destroyers, and 2 aircraft carriers to the coastline of Iraq and Kuwait. And the reason that they sent them there was so that this flotilla of ships could protect the ground troops, which are the US Marines that would go in to Iraq and Kuwait. Now, the exercises prior to the ground invasion were the 2 aircraft carriers, the USS Saratoga and the USS Kennedy, would actually launch their A-6 fighter jets into the land and then drop bombs there and then come back. Well, Michael Riley's story comes to us on the second day of that ground invasion, essentially the very next day after the troops were sent in by foot. And his job was to monitor the radar on the HMS Gloucester, which is a British battleship, and he had one single job. monitor the radar to see if there are any attacks coming from the ground, and if there are, then we can neutralize those attacks onto our flotilla. All right? And so he was tasked to observe that radar, and that was all he did. And the reason that it was such an important job was because the Iraqis actually had something called a silkworm missile. If you don't know what that is, the silkworm missile is a Chinese-made missile that has a very, very massive payload, and a direct hit by one of these silkworm missiles can sink a battleship. And so if you remember the game, You Sank My Battleship, the game requires 5 direct hits on your ship. In this particular instance, 1 direct hit will just sink an entire destroyer. So he was tasked to looking at that radar screen and making sure that there were no silkworm missiles coming their direction. And if there were, he had an arsenal at his disposal called sea darts, which are sea-to-air missiles that kind of neutralize the attack that comes from the land, and they're created by Hawker Harrier Company, Hawker Siddeley Enterprises, which also built the Harrier jump jet. So he's sitting there at the radar room on the second day of the ground invasion, observing what's happening there, and all of a sudden, as he's looking at the radar, 2 neon green blips appear on his screen. And as he's looking at these 2 neon green blips, there's a sense of fear and dread that overcome him. And he's absolutely sure that these are silkworm missiles that are coming in his direction. So he gives the order to prepare the sea darts to launch them, to neutralize these 2 neon green blips that are coming in his direction. And he's got 40 seconds to actually pull the trigger and launch the sea darts. But he's got a little bit of a problem. And here's what the problem is. For the past 6 weeks, Michael Riley has been observing this radar screen. And remember, the ground troops hadn't been in there yet. But these A-6 fighter jets have been taking off from the USS Kennedy and the USS Saratoga, dropping bombs in Iraq and coming back, and they go wet feet, which is the technical term for when they appear on the naval radar. They went wet feet on that naval radar at about the same point that these 2 neon green blips appeared on the radar. So he was faced with a decision, a monumental decision of life and death. And here's the decision. If these are silkworm missiles and he chooses not to launch the sea darts, it's going to sink a battleship. Hundreds of lives are going to be lost. It's going to be one of the most devastating catastrophes of this war. On the other hand, if he gives the order to fire the sea darts, and these happen to be A-6 fighter jets and not silkworm missiles, then what he's done is killed 4 of his own men, 4 of the people from his allied troops. He'll be court-martialed. He'll have to stand in an investigation. His entire military, which is spotless up to this point, will be tarnished. But most importantly, he'll be the one that has to go and break the news to the dead men's families. Got 40 seconds to make his decision. Sweat beading on his brow, hands trembling, his upper lip biting on his upper lip, nerves as all get out. And as the time is running down, as the clock is ticking down, as these 2 neon green blips are converging on the flotilla, he finally gives the order, launch. And he watches as these sea darts converge on these 2 neon green blips and eventually obliterate them out of the sky, 700 yards off the bow of the USS Missouri. As soon as this explosion happens at 5:01 in the morning, his commanding officer comes into the naval radar room and says, "Lieutenant Commander Michael Riley, what just happened?" And Commander Riley gives a very unsatisfactory answer, and the answer is this: "I think I shot down some silkworm missiles." And his commanding officer asks him, "You think? What does that mean?" To which Michael Riley changes his answer and says, "I'm absolutely certain that I shot down 2 silkworm missiles." And his commanding officer goes, "How do you know they were silkworm missiles?" To which Michael Riley gives a very classic answer, one of the most ungratifying answers that anybody can ever hear. "I don't know. I just know." Well, this makes the commanding officer very, very nervous. So he quarantines Michael Riley in a room and he conducts an investigation. And here's what he does. He sends out small boats to scour the wreckage to see what exactly it was that Riley had shot down. He orders an inventory, a hand count of all of the A-6 fighter jets on the USS Kennedy and the USS Saratoga to make sure that all the A-6 fighter jets are there. And Michael Riley is sitting by himself in a room for 4 to 4.5 hours, probably the longest 4 hours of his life, wondering, what has he done? What has he done? What has he done? Eventually, the investigation comes back. Commanding officer goes into Lieutenant Riley's quarantined room and tells Lieutenant Commander Riley, "Your sea darts shot down 2 silkworm missiles." He emerged from that incident as a hero. But when it was all said and done, his answer was not gratifying. It was, "I don't know, I just knew." Well, the British Navy decided, we're not happy with that answer. We're going to conduct an investigation. So they actually went there and did an investigation. They looked at the tapes of that radar room for that entire day, the second day of the ground invasion, looked at it over and over and over and over and over again. And after the course of about a month of studying those tapes, they came to the conclusion that Lieutenant Commander Riley on that particular day, on the second day of the ground invasion, got lucky. He flipped a coin and guessed right on that day. And that's how the case was closed. And that's how it rested for the longest time. Not a very gratifying answer. It rested that way until this person decided to get involved. You're probably wondering who this guy is. This guy is a fellow by the name of Gary Klein. He is a cognitive psychiatrist, and he studies, he is based out of Chicago, Illinois. He is also the consultant to the U.S. Marine Corps, but his most famous work is the work that he's done with firefighters. And the one thing that always fascinated about Dr. Klein about firefighters was somehow when a firefighter, a seasoned veteran firefighter, goes into a building that's burning, they intuitively know which way to go to get to safety. No burning building is exactly the same. Imagine this, if you will. A building is burned down. Likelihood is you're not probably going to go there for another fire again, right? Because the building's gone. Not only that, the fire itself is an enemy that's organic. No two fires behave the same way, and that's why firefighting is such a difficult task, because the fire can move in whatever direction they want. Not only that, when a firefighter is called onto the scene, they don't have time to study the blueprints of the building that they're going into. They see the building, they hear the screams, and they rush into the building. But somehow or other, these firefighters intuitively know how to get out of the burning building, whether they should go left at the corridor or right at the corridor, whether they should go up the stairs or down the stairs. They intuitively know which way to go to get to safety. And Gary Klein did a study with the firefighters, and he asked them a very simple question. He said, hey, Joey, when you went into the Sears Tower when it was burning, you went left at this corridor. We were monitoring your movements. You went left at this corridor rather than right. Why did you go that way? And the answer that he got from these firefighters were, I don't know, I just knew. And what's really bizarre about that is, if it's literally the flip of a coin, 50-50, the statistics would play out that half the time these firefighters would die and the other half of the times they would emerge in safety. But the statistics play out that a majority of the time, and not just a small majority, a vast majority of the time, these firefighters emerge to safety. Not only that, the U.S. Marine Corps is the same way. If you see these soldiers that are sent out to battle, no two battlefields are the same. And no two situations are the same. It's because the enemy here, other than the fire, the enemy is organic. You don't know what they're going to do. But intuitively, these Marines know which way to go to get to safety. Do we go behind the buildings? Do we go down the main road? Do we hide behind the tanks? And for the most part, they emerge in safety as well. And Gary Klein, when he asked them the questions, how did you know that this was the strategy you should implement on the battle scene, on the spot? No planning involved, just on the spot. You knew how to get to safety. Their answer came out to be exactly the same as Lieutenant Commander Michael Riley's answer, which was, I don't know, I just knew, and it felt right. So what Gary Klein did was, he said, Commander Riley's answer, I've heard that before, and it intrigues me that I've heard that before. There's got to be something there. So Gary Klein requisitioned all of the tapes from the HMS Gloucester, and unlike the British Navy that just observed the tapes from that particular moment, that particular day when the Silkworm missiles were shot down, Dr. Klein actually went back and observed all of the tapes that led up to that incident, the 6 weeks of tapes that represented what Michael Riley saw on the radar screen. And after studying those tapes for about a month or so, he came to the conclusion he actually found a discrepancy. And here's the discrepancy that he found. A-6 fighter jets, when they're coming back from their mission, from dropping bombs in Iraq and Kuwait and coming back, they go wet feet at the coastline, and they're traveling about 7,000 feet above sea level. And they're traveling high enough that they become visible on the naval radar on the first sweep of the radar. The Silkworm missiles on that particular day are launched from the ground so that when they actually hit the shoreline, when they become visible on the naval radar, there's a touch of ground interference, which makes them become visible on the radar sweep, not on the first sweep, but on the second sweep of the radar, a full second to 2 seconds later. And Gary Klein theorized that it was that slight discrepancy, that imperceptible discrepancy that even Riley couldn't explain, that caused Michael Riley to have this unexplainable sense of fear and dread, this anxiety, the sweaty palms, the sweaty forehead, the trembling lip. All of these things were caused by that very, very imperceptible discrepancy between the 6 weeks prior and on that particular day. That was his theory. And you're probably wondering, well, what is it about that particular small discrepancy that would make someone have such an adverse reaction? And the answer to that question comes from this fellow right here, Dr. Wolfram Schultz. Dr. Schultz is actually a neuropsychiatrist. He is a person that studies human behavior and decision-making, and he studies this out of Cambridge University. And it took me a long time to find this picture. I actually knew that he had won the Golden Brain Award, and you see him in this picture with the Golden Brain Award. It's an award that's given to a psychiatrist or somebody that's in the neuropsychology field that's made a significant contribution to the field. And so you're probably wondering, what is it that Dr. Schultz has done to get this kind of renowned award, the Golden Brain Award? Well, he studied a small neurotransmitter in the brain called dopamine. And the whole reason that he was so fascinated with dopamine, and in case you guys don't know, dopamine is that neurotransmitter that has traditionally, since Woodstock, been known as the neurotransmitter that's associated with sex, drugs, and rock and roll. It's that thing that makes us like the sex, drugs, and rock and roll so much. And it's that thing that makes all of the parents that have teenage children shudder because they're like, oh, I wish our kids didn't have this dopamine in them, because that's what makes them get into trouble and all that kind of stuff. Now, why was Dr. Schultz so fascinated with dopamine? Well, originally he wasn't. He was originally very fascinated with hedonism. And he had written a couple of grant proposals that said, I want some money from you to study hedonism, to study pleasure. And they all turned him down, and he thought to himself, all right, this is not going anywhere. So he finally recouched it in terms of dopamine. He said, all right, if they're not going to give me money to study hedonism, I want to study it anyway. What can I do to get money? He says, I'm going to study the dopamine system, rewrote all of his grant proposals, and got a grant to study dopamine. In essence, he got to study hedonism with money from other people. Got money. Well, what experiments did Dr. Schultz do? Well, he did some very fascinating early experiments with monkeys and the dopamine neurons in the monkey brains. And what he did was he connected up the individual dopamine neurons in the monkey brains to a sensor, and he measured the dopamine response of all of these monkeys to various different stimuli to see what it would be that caused these neurotransmitters in the brain to fire off. And his experiment was a very controlled experiment. He would feed these monkeys little squirts of juice, different types of juice, and measure the response. So he would squirt the orange juice into the monkey's mouth, and the monkey would hate the orange juice, and you'd say, yeah, no response from the dopamine receptors. And a little known fact that you don't know, monkeys love pomegranate juice. They also love apple juice. So the first level of experiments, he squirted different juices into the monkey's brain, and the juices that they liked, apple juice and pomegranate juice, he found out that when he squirted the apple juice into the monkey's mouth, the monkey's dopamine receptors went wild. You know, the neurotransmitters went wild. They would fire off the rat-tat-tat-tat-tat-tat, and they would just go nuts. And this was kind of expected. You give a monkey something that the monkey likes, it stimulates its pleasure centers, and you see this response in the dopamine receptors, right? Expected. So he continued on with this experiment where he had all these monkeys that were in the cage, and he kind of squirted apple juice in their mouth every day. But one of the things that he realized was that over time, as these monkeys were getting squirted with apple juice in their mouth, their joy of receiving the apple juice diminished. So the dopamine response that they got started off very, very high, and then it kind of waned down and it kind of diminished. Now, don't get me wrong. The monkeys still enjoyed the apple juice. Squirt the apple juice in their mouth, and they still get happy. But their happiness was not even close to their original happiness of getting that apple juice initially. And this kind of makes sense, even for the human mind. We are just a separate form of a primate, so it kind of makes sense to us. If you imagine, if you have small children, on Christmas Day, these kids go downstairs, under the Christmas tree, there's a present, they get really excited, and what do they do with the Christmas presents? They open up the wrapping, they rip the whole thing up, and they get really excited with the present, right? And they play with that all day long. By New Year's Day, where is this present? Sitting in the corner collecting dust, right? And part of it is that's our human nature. We are just by very naturally ungrateful creatures. and you laugh and I laugh with you, but the reality of it is, I start this analogy with the kids, but y'all are the same way. Let me give you an example. How many people out there own an iPhone? Can I just see a show of hands for a second? Yeah, there are a lot of people. For all of you, or a BlackBerry device, any kind of cell phone, my guess is this, my prediction is this. On the first day that you got that cell phone, you spent about 4 or 5 hours goofing around on that thing, right? As of today, I bet you it's just that device that sits in your pocket, that takes calls, makes calls, and interrupts CLEs. I think that's about it, right? So we are by nature ungrateful creatures, and that's what Dr. Schultz found out, was that these dopamine neurons would fire off and they would get very excited, but that excitement would wane off after time. Well, one day as he was going into this lab, and remember, he studies hedonism, so he didn't get really the pick of the litter when it came to offices. He got a really, really run-down office to conduct his monkey experiments, and creaky doors and windows, wind blowing through all over the place. It was just enough not to get the PETA people to march against him, but enough to do the experiments. And one day as he's going into his laboratory to do the experiments, he opens the door, and as it's creaking open, he hears this distinctive rat-a-tat-tat-tat-tat sound of the dopamine neurons firing. And so he asked himself a very simple question. Wait a second. I haven't given the monkeys any apple juice yet. Why are they getting so excited? And he kind of hypothesizes, maybe they hear this door creaking and they know that the apple juice is coming. So maybe they're getting excited because they are anticipating the reward that they are going to get. And he establishes a very, very clever study, very similar to the Pavlovian study. He decides, as a second set of experiments, rather than just giving the monkey squirts of apple juice, what he did was he rang a bell and then squirted the apple juice in the monkey's mouth. And the same Pavlovian experiment, rang the bell, squirted the apple juice, rang the bell, squirted the apple juice. And what he found out was that after about 4 or 5 days of doing this, the dopamine receptors started firing off when the monkeys heard the bell. So it caught him thinking, well, what happens if I kind of take this one step farther back? And so he conducted a third set of experiments, and the third set of experiments was he would shine a light in the monkey's eyes, ring the bell, and squirt the apple juice. Shine the light, ring the bell, squirt the apple juice. Shine the light, ring the bell, squirt the apple juice. And guess what happened on about the 4th or 5th day of these experiments? When the monkeys saw the flash of light, the dopamine receptor started to go off. And he carried that experiment one step farther back, and he did a playing the song, flashing the light, ringing the bell, squirting the apple juice. Playing a song. And what he realized was that these monkeys' behaviors, the dopamine neurons, adapted to the first event in time that would predict the reward. So the dopamine neurons themselves were not interested in the apple juice per se. The apple juice is a great reward, but they would fire off at the first event in time that would properly predict that reward to come. And because of that, Dr. Schultz named these dopamine neurons predictor neurons. They would predict where the reward was going to be. And if we think about it from an evolutionary standpoint, this only makes sense, right? If you are that monkey that can predict where the apple juice is going to be, or where the bananas are going to be, or where the food or the reward is going to be, and you can predict it before all of the other monkeys can predict it, guess what? You will maximize your reward, right? You'll be the first monkey on the scene. You can have more apple juice or bananas. And so from an evolutionary perspective, it makes sense that the dopamine works in this way. It is the predictor of the first event in time that predicts the reward at the end. So he wrote a couple of papers on that predictor signal. And after he got those things published, he ran out of experiments to do, so he was about to shut down his lab, and one day he decided, hey, I wonder what happens if I do this. And he walked into the lab, and he played the song, flashed the light, rang the bell, and walked away. Didn't give the monkey the reward that they were expecting. And the first thing that he noticed was that the monkeys got royally pissed off. They sat there and they rattled their cages. And then the second thing that he noticed is after their anger subsided, they got very, very depressed by the whole thing. And so he conducted an entire set of experiments to see what would happen if he withheld the reward after the prediction had come into play, meaning that the monkeys had predicted they were going to get apple juice or pomegranate juice, but he withheld that reward. And when he measured the dopamine response of the monkey brains, what he found out was that when the monkeys were expecting a reward and they did not get the reward, the dopamine neurons fired off a very characteristic signal that was different from the prediction signal. And he called this the prediction error signal. Essentially, it was something that told the monkeys, wait a second, you were expecting a reward, but you didn't get it. And it fired off this very characteristic signal that made these monkeys really mad. And from an evolutionary standpoint, this also makes sense as well, if you think about it. If a monkey is going to travel 10 miles to go to where the banana trees are, and he gets there and he finds out that there's no banana trees, there's a whole bunch of time that's wasted, a whole bunch of energy that's wasted. And in the animal kingdom, it's all about efficiency. You don't want to trek all that distance for a reward that you think is going to be there and not be there. So what this prediction error signal does is it tells these monkeys, you were expecting this reward, you didn't get it. Find out why. Rewire your brain in such a way. Figure out what this error was. And the whole purpose of it is this negative feedback cycle where it's trying to maximize the efficiency of the monkey brain. Trying to figure out, we're going to properly predict the reward rather than incorrectly predicting the reward. And he characterized this as the prediction error signal and got a couple of papers published based on that prediction error signal. Now, with this dopamine background in the back of our heads, we can now go back to Lieutenant Commander Michael Riley and what happened on that fateful day, on that second day of the ground invasion. He's looking at the naval radar. 5:01 in the morning, after he's gotten his first cup of coffee, looking to see if these Silkworm missiles are being launched at him, and he sees these 2 neon green blips appear on his radar. And he's thinking to himself, wait a second, these could be A-6 fighter jets. And his rational mind is wrestling with this issue. But unbeknownst to him, in the subterranean subconscious of his mind, there's this one tiny little dopamine neuron that goes, wait a second, these are not the same two green blips that you're used to seeing. There's something different about these. And Michael Riley couldn't explain what that difference was. It took Dr. Klein an entire month to figure out what that difference was. He couldn't explain it within the 40 seconds that he had to launch that. But something in the back of his mind, one tiny little neuron said, wait a second, these blips are different. And that neuron fires off this characteristic signal called the prediction error signal. It works its way across synapse to synapse to synapse and finds its way into the anterior cingulate cortex in our brain. And for the lay folks out there that are not medical professionals, the anterior cingulate cortex, when I studied at WPI, we used to call those things the O circuit, because if you've ever had that moment where you go, oh, that's the part of the brain that gives you that response. Finally works its way there and tells the brain there's something about these two green blips that are different. And that's what caused Michael Riley to break out in a sweat, to have him tremble at the fear that these two neon green blips that he couldn't even explain why they were different. The process by which he made that decision, life and death decision, was an emotional process based on dopamine. Now, why do I spend about 40 minutes of our CLE just talking about dopamine and all these stories? Because we finally now get to the heart of our discussion, and we are going to talk about addiction. Now, in particular, we don't have time to talk about every kind of addiction, so I'm going to focus on one because there's a story that's associated with this. It's a gambling addiction that we're going to talk about. And this story is brought to us by a woman by the name of Anne Kleinestever. Now, Anne Kleinestever is an English teacher in West Virginia. And in her early 50s, she developed Parkinson's disease. And in case you don't know what Parkinson's disease is where the dopamine in your brain slowly starts to get depleted. And because of the depletion of the dopamine cells in your brain, what ends up happening is you start losing motor control, you start seizing up, you start trembling, you start having these shakes. And people are familiar with what the symptoms of Parkinson's disease are. Well, Anne Kleinestever, as the English teacher, was diagnosed with Parkinson's. And her doctors placed her on a treatment that included a dopamine agonist. And in case you don't know what a dopamine agonist is it's a drug that you take that floods the brain with a dopaminergic precursor. And what it does is it amplifies the signals of the dopamine receptor. So it only makes sense, right? You have a certain number of dopamine cells in your head. Well, you just amplify the signal that it generates, right? So the dopaminergic precursor amplifies those signals. And what's bizarre about these dopamine agonists is over time, the person has to get placed on a higher and higher and higher dose of these agonists because more and more dopamine cells are getting depleted from the brain. Well, one of the really bad side effects that affects about 10 to 15% of the people that are on dopamine agonists is they develop a gambling addiction. And Anne Kleinestever was one of them. And she tells the story about when she was in the throes of this gambling addiction, that she would go in West Virginia to one of these local racinos, which is a dog track, sit there with a bucket of quarters and play slots all day long until about midnight when the dog track closed. And then she would move on over to a convenience store, and apparently unlike Ohio or Georgia, the convenience stores in West Virginia have slot machines, and she would sit there and play the slots for another 3 hours until the convenience store shut down. And then she would go home, get on the computer, and play slots just for the fun of it until 6 o'clock in the morning when she would get dressed and go back in to the racinos and play. And she would repeat this cycle over and over and over again, and she couldn't stop that addiction. You're wondering to yourself, this is a high school English teacher. She's a fairly smart woman. She should know that these slot machines don't pay out. And in fact, they don't. If you really think about it, slot machines pay off, anywhere between 75 to 95 cents on the dollar, right? Nobody makes money on the slots. She knew this. What is it then about this smart woman that would cause her to keep pulling these slots? And eventually what had ended up happening was her entire marriage dissolved. She lost her entire life savings, $250,000 on slots. She was so addicted to this that she couldn't even eat properly. Her entire daily diet consisted of eating peanut butter right out of the jar. And then she would get home, she would collapse after 3 or 4 days of gambling, and then the moment that she woke up, you know what she would do? Right back to the racinos. And she would start gambling over and over and over again. And you're wondering, what is it about this educated person that would make them such an addict to such a silly little device like a slot machine? Well, the answer to that also comes from Dr. Schultz's work on the dopamine receptors, and here's what it is. Dr. Schultz did actually a fourth set of experiments. Remember, he talked about the prediction neurons and the prediction error signal, but he actually did an experiment on a fourth set of experiments relating to dopamine neurons, and here was his experiment. One day, as he was closing up his lab, thinking he was done with the experiments, he thought, all right, I've done the light experiment, I've done the prediction error stuff, I think I'm done now, I think I'm going to retire. He walks in, and he had a bottle of apple juice that was kind of half full still, and he goes, all right, the monkeys have been good, I'm going to feed them one last time. And rather than going through the routine of playing the song, ringing the bell, and doing all of that stuff, he just randomly squirted the apple juice into the monkey's mouth. And what happened was, what he noticed was that these dopamine receptors fired off like crazy. A random reward that the monkeys got, and the level of dopamine that he measured from these monkey brains was 4 to 5 times greater than the predictable reward. So in other words, a surprising dose of apple juice tastes better than a routinely predictable dose of apple juice. And he kind of wondered to himself, why is this? And he came to this conclusion, and again, if you think about it from an evolutionary perspective, it only makes sense, right? Something random has happened, something exciting has happened in our lives where we got a reward, right? And so this dopamine neuron fires off a signal that's 4 to 5 times greater. Why does it do that? Well, the brain is trying to get your attention. It's saying, look, you just got something good here. Pay attention. If you can figure out a pattern for why this happened, guess what? You can be the first monkey on the scene and get all of the apple juice, so pay attention. And so his theory was that when there's a surprising jolt of a reward, then the dopamine neuron will fire off at a higher level to get your attention so that the brain will start wiring itself to try to find this pattern. Because if you can find the pattern, guess what? You can get the reward. Well, knowing that, what do we know about Anclonestiver? Well, and what do we know about slot machines? Well, I'll tell you a dirty little secret about slot machines. I'm a patent law guy, so I'm going to tell you a dirty little secret. Slot machines, there is no secret. There's a random number generator in one of these electronic slot machines that literally is programmed in such a way that it'll pop up a number, and it's programmed in such a way that you can't predict what that number is. Can you imagine if everybody could predict when the next slot pull is going to win you $1 million? Yeah, they write it in such a way that nobody can predict what that outcome is going to be. But every once in a while, something exciting happens at these slot machines. Has anybody played slots in here? Yeah, you know what that exciting thing is, right? Cha-ching! You know, the sirens start going off, the bells, you know, the lights start going off, the money starts going down, clink, 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 and there's an exciting reward that happens here. And for Anclonestiver, what had happened was when that slot, that random pull of the slot, one day hit a jackpot for her, her dopamine neurons went nuts. It was a random reward that she'd gotten, and remember, random rewards trigger a dopamine response that's 4 to 5 times greater than a predictable reward, right? What else do we know about Anclonestiver? Not only was her dopamine response 4 to 5 times greater than a predictable reward, it was amplified because she was on a dopaminergic med. And so the amplification of the signal made that response, that pleasure center in her brain, go off to such a level that it was so alluring that she could no longer resist the temptation to play the slots. And her brain was firing off these receptors saying, pay attention, something's happening here. You can predict when this reward is going to come. And if you can predict when that reward is coming to come, you can become a multimillionaire. But guess what? Nobody can ever predict when that reward is going to come on a slot machine. So she ended up ruining her entire life based on the slots. And you're wondering to yourself, well, yeah, but that's slot machines and that's dopamine. I don't think I'm addicted to anything. Well, remember at the very beginning of our talk, we talked about the 4 questions. I said if you answered yes to any one of these 4 questions, or to any 2 of these 4 questions, you need to kind of sit down and do an evaluation on whether you do or might have an addiction problem. I'd like to bring it where the rubber meets the road and kind of ask you a very, very simple question. And you don't have to raise your hands, but it would be entertaining for me to actually do a poll like I do with my students. But I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands, but I'd like to think about it in the back of your mind. How many people, actually, on this one I'll actually ask, how many people drink coffee here? Go to Starbucks and get a cup of coffee every once in a while? All right. What's the first thing that happens when you walk into a Starbucks? The smell overcomes you, right? Yeah. The light flashes. The smell overcomes you. What happens after that? You stand in line, right? You place your order, and what do they do after that? They write your name on the cup, right? Makes it very personalized. And your name, please? Sam. There you go. Your personalized cup here is your coffee's going to come out in that thing. And then you hear them making the coffee in the background with all the noise that's going on. The aroma has filled your mind. And essentially, you've heard the song, seen the flashing lights. The bell's gone off. And the only thing that's waiting for you at the end of that is what? A delicious cup of coffee. The reason I use such a benign substance is I wanted to illustrate the point that it really is a controlled substance. It's not a controlled substance, but it is a substance. It's a chemical substance, and caffeine is a dependency as well. So we'll go over to the Starbucks. I stole their image, but I think for educational purposes, this is fair use. We'll go through the 4 questions to see if we really do have an addiction to coffee. So for all of you that have raised your hand and said, yes, I do drink coffee, let's think about this. First question. Have you ever asked yourself, man, I should cut back from this substance? Coffee. I should cut back on coffee and caffeine. If you answered yes to that in your mind, that's 1 of 4. Second question. Have you ever gotten annoyed or frustrated when you've been cut off from this substance? You're sitting in your office, law firm, you go to the coffee maker to get a cup of coffee. Joe Smith down the hall just drank the last cup of coffee, and darn him, he didn't make a fresh pot. Smite him. Die, Joe! You know, have you ever been annoyed at the fact that you've been cut off from the substance? If you've answered yes to that, that's 1 out of 4. If you've answered yes to both of those, that's 2 out of 4 so far. Third question. Have you ever needed the substance as an eye-opener? Wake up in the morning and you think to yourself, oh gosh, where's my cup of coffee? Where's my cup of coffee? I need my coffee to get through the day. If you've answered yes to that, that's 3 out of 4. Now the fourth one, have you ever missed a deadline or been late for a meeting or work or anything because of this substance? And all of you are thinking, oh, I've never done that. Well, let me give you an example and see if you fall into this category. You finally walk into Starbucks, remember, and the song is playing, right? The aroma of the coffee. That's the first triggering event for your reward, right? And you look at the line and there are 50 people in line in front of you. You know that if you stand in line and you wait there, you're going to be late for work, 10 minutes. But guess what? I am not leaving this place without my coffee. I am standing in line. I am not leaving this place without that Starbucks latte because I have smelled the aroma. The bell has gone off, and if it doesn't, then the prediction error neurons in my head are going to fire off, and I don't want to go through the day like this, so I'm waiting, so you're 10 minutes late for work. Has it ever happened to you? Maybe it's an exaggeration, but has something similar to that happened to you? If so, that's 4 out of 4. Now, we're about 5 minutes away from the end of the presentation. I do want to say something that's kind of unrelated to the presentation. First of all, I wanted to thank all of you for coming. The substance of what I have to talk about is done. But I wanted to cycle back to the State Bar of Ohio and the presupposition that they have in going through the substance abuse programs and everything that they have. As I said, every state bar in every state presumes that it's the stress of the profession that creates the addicts, and not that the addicts are the ones that are attracted to the profession. And depending on what the proper answer is, the correct answer to that question is, the solution is going to be different, I believe. Again, I'm a scientist. I did graduate work in medical research, and essentially, the question has to be the right question before the answer can be the right one. And if the State Bar of Ohio is asking the wrong question, presuming that it's the stress of the profession that's creating the addicts, and not that those that are predisposed to addiction are attracted to the profession, then I think that the solutions and the programs and everything that they've implemented are really nothing more than a temporary fix because it doesn't go to the heart of the problem. The person that does research on this kind of stuff is a forensic psychiatrist or somebody that's interested in it at Harvard Medical School. Her name is Helen Farrell. And she has done research to show that the addictions that people have, whether it be substances, drugs, cigarettes, nicotine, whatever it comes down to, those addictions, there is a genetic component to it as well. Now, what's really bizarre is we had done the substance abuse presentation as kind of a tag team at the State Bar of Ohio when we were doing the research for this. We were looking to see if there had been any literature, any studies that had been done to actually show that it was the stress of the profession that creates the addicts and not the other way around, the chicken and the egg problem, essentially. And nobody has done that study yet. Nobody has done that study yet, nobody in the medical field. And I found that to be a little bizarre because at the end of the day, if we don't do that study, then we are asking the wrong question, to which we will always get the wrong answer. Now, the reason I say that is because I give you that part of my story is I have a couple of colleagues of mine, including Dr. Farrell at Harvard Medical School, that's willing to do this kind of study. And so if any of you out there know somebody at the Supreme Court of Ohio that's willing to give me an audience for an hour where I can propose this to them, I think that this is a study that's well worth doing. Again, this is academic rather than it is practice related. But it's a study that I think is important enough that it needs to be done, and I have colleagues that stand ready, willing, and able to do that kind of study. So if you have anybody that you know at the State Bar of Ohio that you can connect me up with, I'd really appreciate it. Last thing, again, I thank all of you for coming back to the University of Dayton and giving back to the school. We always appreciate your participation in these events. Please be sure to fill out the CLE evaluation forms, and please enjoy the rest of the day. If you have any questions, I'm here for answers.